having watched the launch of this body yesterday in Davos, that really confirmed the worst fears and suspicions that this new organization is not really designed to be a vehicle for pursuing global peace and conflict resolution, but rather for pursuing the narrow interests of the Trump administration and of Donald Trump himself. Within the first 10 minutes of Donald Trump speaking, he had listed how many countries he had bombed as president. He had bragged about how powerful the US military is, and he was gloating about how much oil that he'd taken out of Venezuela since he attacked in the last few weeks. But more importantly than Donald Trump's words, you simply have to look at his actions as president to really understand what this new organization is all about. Trump has really approached trying to pursue policy globally through threats, through trade bullying, and through international intimidation. And you simply have to look at his actions in Venezuela and his threats over Greenland to see how he has torn through international law and the set of rules that we have sought to kind of govern ourselves as a world order in the last half century or so. I think that is really what this organization is all about. It's trying to dismantle existing institutions that have governed the world, particularly the United Nations, and try to replace them with an organization which Trump himself can rule over, and at the same time which really stokes his sort of narcissism and ego. So I would say, this new organization is not really an organization like we've seen previously in terms of the United Nations that has global buy-in. Rather, this is a self-proclaimed organization that really doesn't have any legitimacy.
If you look at the countries who have signed up to this board, they seem to be countries that have close relationship with the president himself. You've got the Gulf states, you've got Israel, and those are the countries who've signed up yet. A lot of the countries in Western Europe, countries like India, China, Russia, to some extent have said they will join, but they weren't there yesterday. So if you look at the countries that are participating and the countries that have stayed away so far, what does it tell you about the future of this organization? Is it a non-starter? Is it dead on arrival? Or do you see more countries perhaps join in as things go on?
Well, I think its current composition is quite sort of Middle Eastern centric. And of course, the Board of Peace was supposedly initially set up to try to create a long-term conflict resolution, particularly the situation in the Gaza Strip. But I think you're absolutely right to point out the fact that actually its composition is mainly of people who have existing quite close ties to Donald Trump. We have seen Trump try to fill it with people that he sees as having a particular strategic importance to both himself and the United States. But you're absolutely right in mentioning the fact that Europe hasn't really participated, despite the fact that it's received invitations. We've also seen Mark Carney reject the invitation that Donald Trump lent out to him. But you've also seen people like Vladimir Putin invited to the Board of Peace, which I think has really been the main reason why you haven't had wider Western buy-in from Canada and Europe, particularly given that Vladimir Putin is currently engaged in an imperial invasion against a European nation, which of course undermines the whole idea that this board is designed to pursue peace. So I think really what Donald Trump is hoping is that he's going to slowly expand the composition of the organization, because really its current composition leaves it with quite limited options in terms of trying to exert influence around the world.
Do you think that Trump could perhaps use this board to get symbolic international sanction for his acts that otherwise would not? I'm talking about things like, for example, the operation that he carried out in Venezuela. No international body, including the UNG or the UNSC, was ever going to sanction what he did. Or whether you're talking about the takeover of Greenland, no global body was ever going to sanction it. Do you think he could get the Board of Peace to sign off on these imperialist, misadventurous projects that he seems to be obsessed with?
I highly suspect that Donald Trump is going to try to use the Board of Peace to try to legitimize his actions around the world, which otherwise would actually be considered as illegal under international law and under the international rules-based system. We've clearly seen the United Nations really quite dysfunctional during the Trump era, of course, particularly given the fact that Donald Trump has withdrawn from 66 organizations in the last few weeks, many of which are United Nations involved. So I think rather than try to rely upon existing structures within the United Nations, perhaps within NATO as well, Donald Trump is trying to bestow legitimacy on what he's going to do around the world by trying to take it through a different process which he controls. And of course we know that the Board of Peace gives him as chairman great authority for making decisions. So I think ultimately what we are going to see is Donald Trump try to use this forum as sort of a mechanism for trying to create legitimacy for what he will frame as peace resolving issues around the world. He will try to frame his the way that he will try to intervene internationally in terms of peace issues, and that's how he will try to create this body or try to frame it as having some relevance. So certainly I think we are going to see this organization try to be used by Trump in that way.
Now, one thing that stood out for a lot of people at Davos was that the logo of this Board of Peace is quite similar to that of the United Nations, and the President himself admitted that, who knows, maybe one day it might replace the UN. Now, we all know how much Donald Trump hates multilateralism and multilateral bodies. Like you mentioned, he's pulled out of some 70-odd UN-related bodies. Just this week, he pulled out of the World Health Organization. Do you see this as perhaps the first stepping stone towards Donald Trump making the nuclear move, which is completely leave the United Nations and the UNGA as well? Do you see this as a stepping stone perhaps towards that?
I think that's certainly probably what the Trump administration will be trying to approach from a kind of strategic perspective, in that if they withdrew from the United Nations and other mass international organizations right now, that would look quite bad, in the sense that there would be a huge vacuum for international rules and order to kind of be governed in a certain way. So I think what we will be seeing is that this body will try to fill the purpose of the United Nations, and we will see the United States use this body in a way that it did previously use the United Nations. So we're going to kind of see the Trump administration take a more of a transitional approach to this. They will slowly try to grow the size of this organization, so that when and if the United States does withdraw from more United Nations bodies, or even from the United Nations overall, that actually there will be an existing structure in place that they can say, well, actually this is now the main organization for creating rules and making decisions in the world, which fundamentally is going to be very dangerous, because ultimately that will not have global buy-in. And so you will have rival organizations in the world which will be proclaiming to have legitimacy. So I think really we are heading in a very dangerous direction, where actually previously for the past 60 years or 70 years or so, we've had one organization that the world has kind of looked towards as having legitimacy, but actually Trump is ultimately trying to undermine the global order in a way that gives himself most control.
Right. If you look at his statements in the Charter, there's clearly a focus on conflict resolution as the primary aim of this board. It's called the Board of Peace. So clearly conflict resolution and peace seems to be the objective. I'd like to quote what the Charter says. It says it wants to solve conflicts through pragmatic judgment and common sense solutions. Now, if you look at these words in isolation, they seem great. But if you put it in the Trumpian context, it does seem to me like Donald Trump is going to impose his quick, effective, imposed peace solutions on conflicts around the world, whether that's what we saw in the Iran-Israel war or whether in the ongoing Ukraine war. There seems to be a focus on quick solutions that don't really consider the demands and interests of both sides. Is that going to be perhaps the guiding ideology for the Board of Peace in settling conflicts?
Well, it certainly seems to be the case. I mean, if you look at Donald Trump's previous behavior, that's really the only thing that we can go by in terms of trying to assess what he will do in future. And the reality is Donald Trump doesn't have a worldview of which he bases on kind of post-Second World War values, based on human rights and the rights of self-determination, but rather, kind of values in which he has himself exerted. And you're absolutely right to point out the occasions in which Donald Trump has intervened several times over the past year since he returned to the White House. And it's certainly not been based on any kind of idea rooted in the UN Charter or any rules in the United Nations Security Council. It's been rooted in brute force. And certainly if you look at his intervention in Venezuela, look at his threats towards other territories like Greenland, really Trump has a worldview that might equals right. If you have the power, the physical capabilities to do something, then you can do that. There's nothing to stop you, and actually wider rules and principles don't really stop that from happening, which ultimately is actually deeply dangerous for global peace, because ultimately if you bestow a right on large powers to do whatever they want simply because they are larger, then actually that undermines peace and security around the world, because ultimately small and medium-sized powers become a lot more vulnerable than they used to be honest. But I think the main focus of this initially seems to be on Gaza, but actually if you look at what the Trump's proposals are on Gaza so far, very, very unclear actually how that will resolve the main issues. The composition of the supposed international force in Gaza hasn't been finalized. The fundamental issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict hasn't been resolved. And if you look at the plan that Jared Kushner unveiled during his presentation in Davos yesterday, really that resembled more of a real estate plan plan, a real estate development plan for business opportunities than it did actually a peace plan. So I think ultimately we are going to see a very different kind of United States than we have seen previously in terms of how they try to use this board of peace to make changes in the world.
Right. As things stand, this board does seem to be a non-starter, focused, like you said, on the West Asian or the Middle Eastern countries. But I do want to focus on the flip side, if at all that unfolds. Say tomorrow the Chinese and the Indians decide to join, and suddenly you've got a critical mass of human population now signed on to Trump's board of peace. And say some countries in Western Europe also join in. Do you then see this board gaining legitimacy and proper legitimacy to replace the United Nations? Or do you think the differences that exist between these countries, say between India and China and Russia and Western Europe, that would keep this board away from functioning the way the United States Security Council or perhaps other global bodies do?
I think it's going to be very interesting to see the way that larger powers try to engage with this new board of peace, because I think it really reflects on the different approaches that actually powers around the world have to trying to dealing with Trump. And of course, we've seen a huge range in variation in terms of how countries think they can try to manage Donald Trump. Some have taken a much more forceful approach, like China during the tariff response. Other countries like the European Union or organizations like the European Union have taken an approach to try to de-risk the relationship with the United States, which is to reduce reliance on the United States, but also trying to engage with it to take some kind of damage limitation into account. So I think ultimately, we are going to see those different approaches played out in terms of how they engage with this board of peace. But I think also many countries around the world will be looking to the next few years as sort of a temporary potential solution. And I think the reality is, if they think that joining the board of peace will actually make life for themselves a lot easier the next few years, they may actually participate with actually a view to withdrawing in the board of peace post-Trump, becoming sort of a irrelevant body again, or even disappearing altogether. So it's perfectly possible that temporarily the board of peace may actually become a forum for countries trying to deal with Donald Trump in a way that suits themselves best, but actually that doesn't necessarily mean that they view the board of peace as a long-term replacement for the United Nations.
How much of the blame for the fact that this board now exists and the fact that around 20 countries have joined would you place at the feet of the United Nations and the existing multilateral systems? Because there is a sense, especially after the pandemic, after the Ukraine war and after the Israel-Gaza war, that the United Nations has failed in its mandate to preserve peace, to prevent conflicts, and to improve the lives of people around the world. How much of the blame would you then assign to the United Nations and other organizations for the emergence of the Trump Peace Board?
Well, I think it would certainly be a mistake to blame Donald Trump for all of the issues of the United Nations and the failures of the United Nations. The reality is that I would say it was really the Iraq War in 2003 that really started the fundamental process of the United Nations becoming less relevant, because of course that was when the largest power in the world, the United Nations backed by other European powers, invaded a sovereign state which really had no international legitimacy to do so. And I think really that was the moment in which power sort of shifted away from international institutions and started to move towards sort of unilateral action. And certainly since then, we've seen actually United Nations become less and less relevant. The United Nations Security Council has already been paralyzed really over the last 10 years or so, particularly as the United States has had more and more difficulties dealing with Russia. And so that was meant to be the primary body for decision making in the world. And it's just become completely dysfunctional. And so certainly these issues kind of predated Trump coming along. But I think one of the issues as well is that, the issues of the last, 10 years or so have actually been exacerbated by Trump's return to the White House, because he has reduced funding and reduced participation of the United States for the United Nations. And previously, the United States had been the biggest contributor to UN budgets. And so certainly that has sped up the process of the United Nations becoming less effective. And of course, the result of that is that actually Trump can point to the failings of the United Nations and say, well, this is the reason why it's not working. And so certainly we should be trying to revamp the United Nations and look at different structures that perhaps are more inclusive of small and medium countries around the world, to try to create some restored legitimacy in the United Nations, because ultimately you have people who fundamentally don't believe in the international rule of law, like Donald Trump, who are going to try to take advantage of this and actually destroy the United Nations, which has actually produced a huge amount of peace and progress around the world since its inception.
We've been speaking about the strategic motives perhaps behind why Trump has launched the Board of Peace. I'm wondering if there's also a personal angle to this, because he's essentially chairing this board for life or until he's incapacitated or he willingly steps aside. He's taking $1 billion in payment for a permanent membership on this board, and people handpicked by him are also on this board executing his plans. Do you think this is also about legacy building in a sense, to create perhaps his imprint on the world, that this is what Trump left, perhaps like what Woodrow Wilson did with the League of Nations, or perhaps what the FDR envisioned with the United Nations, and now Trump wants to leave his own mark on the world? Do you think that's also playing a part?
Well, I think with any major decision by Donald Trump, ultimately it is motivated by one thing, and that is Donald Trump himself. You simply have to look at the way that this Board of Peace was unveiled yesterday. Trump initially bragging about all his supposed achievements in office. You then had Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who was singing Trump's praises. And then you had other figures like Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, who were also talking about how brilliant Donald Trump is. And so fundamentally, an organization that is set up to, just advance peace in the world, that actually only talks about how great the chairman is, that really undermines the whole purpose, or the apparent purpose of the organization. And I think if you look at like we were previously talking, the composition of the Board of Peace, that is actually filled so far by a lot of leaders who see themselves as being in a position where they have to praise Donald Trump. If you look at the Pakistani Prime Minister Sharif, he previously made contradictory remarks about Trump's claim that Trump is responsible for the ceasefire that happened between India and Pakistan last year. And then he completely reversed that position after he had meetings with Donald Trump. And if you look at how his statements that he's made on Donald Trump since, he always does so when he's handed a physical piece of paper that he's reading from. And so certainly I think this is all about stoking Donald Trump's ego, his legacy, but also potentially some business and maybe even corruption opportunities. The fact that this is a $1 billion a head membership organization with no obvious and apparent benefits for the members really calls into question how this organization is going to be used. And so I think, as I say, every decision that Trump has to be made should really be viewed through the prism that what is the benefit for Donald Trump in being part of it.
Right. Finally, let me just ask you, if I were to ask you to venture a guess about where this organization or this board would be 3 years from now when Trump is out of office, is it dead before that? Is it dead after he exits office? What would be your assessment about where this board is 3 years from now?
My sense is that this board, even though it may grow in membership to some extent, will ultimately look more and more like an advisory board, or simply as a board that is designed to make Donald Trump look good, when in reality it's simply there to serve the purpose of trying to falsely give the United States legitimacy in terms of doing whatever it wants in the world. I think we are going to see Donald Trump and the United States cite the board as for authority on a whole range of different opinions and actions around the world. And I think as really that takes place, it will become more and more obvious that actually that is really the primary purpose of this organization. And I think as it does so, it will become so clear that really it has no actual democratic or legal authority in the world. And I think at that point when that happens, really the benefits of joining and the legitimacy of it having will become so redundant that actually in 3 years' time, I don't think this will be a strengthened body, but in fact it will be much more obvious for what this body is for. And I think ultimately, Donald Trump, we are, under his presidency, we're heading for very difficult times in the world, and very unstable times in the world. And I think ultimately this body will actually become synonymous with a lot of those, that instability and a lot of those failings for Donald Trump.